Thank you for joining me for another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here at the News Forum where all voices matter. With so much war and conflict in the world today, a Remembrance Day in Canada will be as poignant as ever. Returning to Boom and Bust to help make sense of it all is Dr. John Robson. He is an historian, a filmmaker, and a National Post columnist, as well as professor at Augustine College. Welcome back, John.
Thank you. Good to be here.
I guess whether they knew it or not, going back a century, World War I or the Great War was a conflict that ushered in the destruction of the world order that preceded the war. Kind of feels like we're going through a similar change these days. What are your thoughts?
One of my colleagues had recently posted on the platform formerly known as Twitter that it was weird to have been covering the daily news and now find himself faced with a sense of ominous foreboding. And I said, actually, covering the daily news has generally left me with that sense for decades.
Yeah.
The world is a turbulent and dangerous place. And that's one thing that those who fought in the First World War certainly knew. They had been through a pretty peaceful century, but they knew that it hadn't been by accident and it wasn't free. It's strange to reflect that the First World War, it was the same distance. Well, Vimy Ridge is the same distance roughly from the Battle of Waterloo that we now are from Vimy Ridge.
Mm-hmm.
And the 20th century was a horrifying century. I'm often bemused. Commentators searching for the worst word they can think of will say, well, that's medieval. And I think to myself, if you really want to insult something, why don't you call it 20th century? Two massive wars, concentration camps, and deadly ideologies.
Mm.
One of the things we thought we'd learned is that things like Nazism or Bolshevism are absolutely the greatest possible threat to our security. The wars grow from the ideas.
Right.
And the 19th century on the whole was in the grip of fairly benign ideologies, and the 20th wasn't, and the 21st is not looking good.
It's not looking good. And again, looking back on it, then putting your historian hat on, what are the lessons to be learned from your analysis?
The first one is the Roman classic. If it's around so long it's in Latin, you ought to listen to it. Si vis pacem para bellum. If you want peace, prepare for war. We cannot afford to assume, as people did in the late 20th century, all this talk about the end of history and the final permanent triumph of liberal democracy. This caused us to drop our guard. And I think that was a very, very perilous thing. And another one that clearly has come back with a vengeance is that anti-Semitism is a
Yeah.
very powerful, dangerous, and lasting form of evil. And that we closed our eyes to that one as well. We said never again after the Holocaust. We thought that was that. But these are the kinds of ideas that inspire people to kill in frenzied ways. And if you pretend it's not happening, you get a very nasty surprise. Just like the people who said, oh, Hitler's just this comic opera guy with a mustache. It turns out that that was not true. And so we also need to understand our way of life with its constant self-questioning, self-criticism, exposure of its own weaknesses is actually good because it's self-critical. And if we get too much into the self-criticism and lose sight of the fact that for centuries, we have been asking, what are we doing wrong and how do we fix it? That this has had important benefits. Instead, we've raised young people who think that Western civilization is the worst evil the world has ever seen. And they're in no position to help when something really bad comes up. In fact, too many of them have been found on the other side recently, which is very frightening. But it's not surprising when you think about the way people, including our prime minister, talk about our own society and civilization as though it were terrible. He agreed we were committing a genocide on his watch. And young people think it's true. Canada's a genocidal state, and they forget what a genocidal state really looks like.
Mm-hmm. And indeed, usually these things may start with anti-Semitism, Jew hate against the Jews, but it never really ends there, does it?
No, in fact, one of the things about anti-Semitism, in addition to being a powerful evil force, it's also a red flag. And what struck me, the reason, part what helped me understand this was at one point discovering that Imperial Japan in the 1930s passed anti-Semitic laws.
Mm.
And I thought to myself, it's the most homogenous society on earth. They not only don't have any Jews, they have no idea what a Jew is. But no movement that is sufficiently evil is not also anti-Semitic. And no movement that is not anti-Semitic is not also evil. So it is in addition, as I say, to being inherently evil, it's also a warning. Anytime people start muttering about the Jews, you know that something dangerous to everybody is coming out. As I put it in a recent column, anyone who is an enemy of the Jews is an enemy of God, and anyone who's an enemy of God is an enemy of humanity.
John, we're going to take a brief break. We'll be back after these messages. Please stay with us.